Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, at the very least, good day. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. This Zoom experience is being recorded. Please join me in prayer for spiritual intervention, asking the Spirit to actually give us the gift of an open mind and open heart. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. So we have been looking at step one for several weeks, maybe actually several months. Normally it's about 3 months to take a look at and express my understanding of the big book and my own experience, and to have some dialogue with the participants in the workshop. It takes about 3 months for us, at a minimum, to explore and experience step one. Explore is really important. Get a really solid idea as to the vocabulary, the structure, what Bill and the big book mean by the various words that they use to describe the problem of addiction. That first half of the first step. But I promised all the way through that journey of the first half of the first step with kind of a teaser. It wasn't my intention, it's just how it worked out as I see it in retrospect, that the real problem is not addiction. Although we're spending a lot of time understanding it. And in fact, I'm encouraging you to really get deep into your own personal experience with it so that you can actually re-experience it without, in fact, a relapse, but to re-experience powerlessness in the body, powerlessness in the mind, based on your own personal history, in conjunction with perhaps a new understanding of the big book's approach and a presentation. And last week, I did the first teaching on unmanageability, that second half of the first step. We looked at page 45, where Bill clearly makes a transition. He has not mentioned, like he does in these 2 pages, especially page 45, willpower. And he says the body's a problem and the mind's a problem, but the will is really the problem. And in fact, lack of power is our dilemma. That's a direct quote on page 45. Lack of power, lack of willpower is his implication here, is the dilemma. And then we went to page 52. And we looked at the bedevilments. The big book has a paragraph, that second paragraph, that has that word in it, bedevilment. And I asked you to look it up in a dictionary. We haven't done much work asking you to talk about your definitions, because everybody has different definitions and different ones that they like out of the different definitions. We will do some of that tonight. I particularly like the one in my dictionary that says to be controlled as if by devils. Not to get any type of religious connotation. No. I don't mean that one bit. Not one bit. But from a metaphorical standpoint, quoting St. Paul from the Christian scripture, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. In a very classic way, using another image, I'm a puppet on strings. Most of the time I don't know that, but when I'm thinking about it like this, historically, it looks like circumstances and people have the strings in their hands and I'm reacting. And it doesn't seem like I have any management, control, or influence over my life. It's just like survival of the fittest, as Darwin would say. And this life's a beating, especially when you're in your addiction. But we're talking now about people who are not connected to their addiction, or they have had some abstinence and they're not able to sustain it because the doctor's opinion says we have this phenomenon of restless, irritable, and discontent. For me, that's the most apt description of unmanageability in the big book. Restless, irritable, and discontent. Alcohol was my medication. When I had alcohol, I was not irritable, restless, and discontent. I was a sense of peace and at ease, and I was content, and I had a wonderful sense of self-esteem and a connection to my community. Well, until I overdid it, of course, and then it all fell apart. But that was like, yeah, that's just what happens sometimes. It doesn't happen every time. And it's, oops, sorry, oops, sorry, oops, sorry. Now, in my case, it was periodic. So it was even less observable from the cycles. I'm going to put some things up on the screen just to support the words that I want to use. Well, let me go back to that. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And we've all agreed, or at least I've encouraged you to, substitute the word alcohol, eliminate it if that's not your problem, and put your problem in there in terms of your addiction, whatever that is. It may have been that alcohol was your problem, but now you're sober a year or 5 or 10 or 20, and you've developed other issues that you're concerned about. Maybe you've identified what they are and maybe you haven't, but the issue belongs there. But notice that there's a dash, that our lives had become unmanageable. I've encouraged you to look that word up, and perhaps we'll even explore that tonight. But this is what it looks like when you're in your addiction. But more often than not, people that get free of their addiction eventually start feeling this way again, because something's wrong, something's amiss. There's a hole in my soul. I mean, that's a poetic way of describing this restless, irritable, and discontent. I've used the model, and I'm going to reinforce it all year long because it's basic to at least my approach of the first step, my approach for each step, and my overall approach to all of the steps as a whole. And that is who we are as a human being. The steps, I believe, are essentially an organic methodology built specifically for us as human beings. Not that we are different and human because we have a body. No, that doesn't make us any different than a carrot, a rock, a cat. It doesn't make us any different. We've all got materiality. A rock is inert. It has no consciousness that we're aware of. A carrot has a vegetative consciousness, if you will. It's a stretch, but at least it has a life force that grows. A cat is different than a carrot in that a cat can move around and a cat can learn. A carrot has this basic physiology of growth, but a cat has the basic biology of emotions, literal emotions. The mammals have emotions. In us, the body instinct is managed by the brain stem, one of three brains. We have three brains. The one that sits on top of our neck at the top of the spinal cord is the brain stem. That manages instincts. That's a brain, the first one that was developed in us and then developed over millions of years. That area in us that we call emotions, the limbic system, some people call it or connected to our consciousness, but it's way below our consciousness. It's really a product of the, I didn't even mean to put that up there. It's really a product of the body. Emotions are blind. They're instinctual responses to survival. Anger, fight, and fear, flight, and freeze, dishonesty, meaning camouflage. In humans, it's a conscious thing or an unconscious thing. But what makes us specifically human? Different than a cat, different than a monkey, different than a whale. What makes us specifically human is that we have a mind. Now, we had a big discussion last night. It was very fruitful. And I realized that I needed to be clearer what I mean by mind. The mind is not an organ in us. It's a function of the organ in us, probably the function of the brain at the very least, probably connected to the heart, probably connected to the gut, all in a way of knowing. You hear lots of people talk about knowing intuitively, knowing instinctually. Trying to think of the word for emotion. It'll come back to me. The mind is not a place in us, it's a function in us, a function that allows us to know, allows us to reflect, allows us to transcend ourselves. I mean, we can reflect on the meaning of the words that I'm using right now in an intentional way. No other being can do that. That's why we have language in which we can communicate. But the real function that makes us specifically human and specifically individual is that we have free will. We each have willpower. Again, this is not a place in us. This is not an organ in us. This is a function in us. A function to make a decision, a function to decide, a function to take action on a voluntary basis. It is the basis of law in all civilized society. That people can make a decision and take some action, and they're fully responsible for that decision and the consequences of that action. Now, of course, it's a logical thing if you think about it as deeply as I'm inviting you to, that we can know better without doing better. That's one of the definitions of unmanageability. Some of us don't know, and therefore we operate on ignorance, meaning lack of information. But most of us know better and don't do better. That's what I quoted earlier on. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. Bill recognized that. That's where I've come up with this dynamic from his own model in the way he has created the steps. Listen to step 11, the very final way that step 11 is phrased. The last two phrases. Praying for the knowledge of God's will for us, connected to the mind, and praying for the power to do it. The ability to have my willpower choose to go in that direction that my mind knows is the right direction. He's making that distinction. And he does it throughout the book, and I'll point it out throughout the book. And so we looked deeply at the body and the mind as a problem in addiction. The mind gets hijacked by the obsession, a thought over which we have no control. That's the whole point of no choice. But what does Bill mean when he puts unmanageability in the same category as the body and the mind? He puts it in step 1, doesn't he? Unmanageability, at least as I've interpreted it. Lack of power is our dilemma, lack of willpower. Oh, well, are psychologists and lawyers and the state all wrong? It's not free. We don't have any free will at all. There are some philosophers that believe that everything is predetermined. Bill does not. I do not. I don't believe in predetermination at all, predestination. So how do I reconcile that? That Bill puts unmanageability as the second half of the first step, and by implication throughout the textbook says it's the most important part. Lack of power is our problem. Addiction is not, it's a problem, but it's not the problem. Unmanageability is the problem. What do we mean by then? And where is the will not free and where is the will free? Huge questions. And I've come to an explanation. It works for me in terms of understanding each of the steps in the entire spiritual development or human development. Addiction is the problem of the body and the mind. The spiritual malady, I'm introducing a new term now because Bill does. There's lots of material that I incorporate in my beginning explanations that you haven't, in this course anyway, in this cycle of presentations, that I've not given you assignments of in the big book, or you may not be that familiar with some of the areas in the big book. But it's so relevant on page 64. And if you don't have your big book with you, that's okay. Just make a note, page 64, please, because it reinforces this paradigm, this model that I'm using. In the very last paragraph, Bill's talking about resentments. In the second line, from it stem all forms of spiritual disease. He's talking about a spiritual malady here. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, hello, body and mind, first half of the first step, we have been spiritually sick. Lack of power is our dilemma. This is unmanageability. This is the spiritual malady. Then he says, when the spiritual malady is overcome, he's using the words I've got on the screen, we straighten out mentally and physically. This is how I interpret then what Bill says as we enter into step 10, coming out of step 9 on pages 84 and 85. He says we enter the world of the spirit and we're placed in a position of neutrality, implication with regard to our body and mind. Our addiction is neutralized. We have recovered. I'm using the past tense. We have recovered at this point. By the end of the 9th step, we have recovered. We're placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. And then he warns us, we've entered the world of the spirit, but we're not cured. And we have a daily reprieve. Well, he doesn't tell us a daily reprieve from what? My speculation is the connection, and I'm assuming that he assumes that everybody who's read up to that point and experienced the big book up to that point has the same understanding. That's my interpretation. We're not cured of unmanageability. We have a daily reprieve contingent on our spiritual life. He calls this our way of life. He says we commence this way of life as we clean up the past, as we do step 9, we get instructions on and begin to incorporate in our daily lives the practice of steps 10, 11, and 12. Because we need to keep me clean, step 10. And part of that keeping me clean in step 11 is when we go to bed at night after our day of keeping ourselves in fine spiritual condition, removing the impediments through the step 10 process. If we missed anything, he has inventory for us. So at night, we do step 11, inventory, to clean up what we didn't clean up during the day. And then in the morning, we ask for guidance in meditation. And that cycle then is a daily cycle. Spot check inventory on a conscious basis, 24/7. Awareness of the presence of God on a conscious basis, 24/7. And then in step 12, operating on principles. We have to determine what those are for ourselves in pursuit of 24/7 helping people. Wow, that's a lot. But we're not talking about anything special. We're talking about a change in attitude and a change in motives. And in many cases, a big change in our behavior. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. The real problem is the problem of my will. And I use the word spirit here because when we get to step 2, we're going to try to unpack where does that word fit in. Some people say body, mind, and spirit. I understand that. I think spirit's different than will. I think spirit is the life force in us that houses the body, the emotions, the mind, and the will. And some people call that soul, or we can call that spirit. We'll be talking more about that when we get to step 2. Let's stay with step 1. Substance and process, I've introduced those terms. They're professional terms to distinguish between the kinds of addictions that people have. There's no substance involved with a whole slew of addictions, like gambling, like pornography, like workaholism, like love addiction, like debting addiction, like buying addiction. I mean, there are so many variations on a theme, and we've looked at some of them through your sharing. But it's a percentage of people. Notice it's a percentage of people. Unmanageability, my speculation is it's the human problem. It's not a percentage of people. It's 100%, 10 out of 10 have the unmanageability. Let's take a look at it after we, again, see the varieties of substance and process addictions. I have things there that may appear very creative to you. You may not have thought of fear as an addiction, anger as an addiction, dishonesty as an addiction. Bill says in the 12 and 12, in chapter 4 about inventory, he uses the model of instincts gone awry. Those are the instincts I opened up with: fight, flight, and freeze. More about that later. Step 1 is about powerless. Everybody can quote it. I mean, they don't even have to think about it. It's almost mindless robotic. I want you to think about it. What does it mean? It means no power. It means no choice. Of course, when we're talking about our addiction, it means no choice when I engage in it. All right, I lose control. And Dr. Silkworth was very clear. It was his opinion that there's something biologically wrong with us. Bill, fortunately, had exposure to the Oxford group, and they talked about a transformation of the mind that is necessary because the mind's really the problem. And we pursued that. We looked at obsession and delusion and even the definition of insanity according to the big book on page 37. And that we're powerless. And most everybody really gets that. No choice. But what about this part, the will? Unmanageability, that spiritual malady that I've been discussing with you. That was Carl Jung. Carl Jung is the fellow who sent the first person that we ever know of to find a spiritual experience, Roland Hazard. Roland went to the Oxford group and found his awakening and freedom from alcohol. And then because Dr. Silkworth was treating drunks, Bill Wilson finally found his way into the town's hospital, where Dr. Silkworth explained all of the physical aspects to him as we've gone through his opinion. And Ebby has taken him to the Oxford group, where he's becoming very familiar with the 6 steps of the Oxford group to have this spiritual awakening. And you can see it when you read it. If you want to even do that, it's not part of the assignment until we get to step 2. His introduction and actually working of the steps on page 13 in the big book, and the spiritual experience he has the very next day, the 3rd day of hospitalization, on page 14. But what are the bedevilments? I am having trouble with personal relationships. I can't control my emotional nature. What I did was take them from page 52 in the big book. We looked at it last week. I converted it to personal pronoun, making it about me. I converted it to present tense, not when I'm drinking, not when I'm not abstinent, before I came into the program. Of course, anybody who's connected to their addiction, practicing their addiction, is in fact going to have an unmanageable life. But this is about people who have some abstinence, whether it be a week or a decade, it doesn't make any difference. And it's a question about my current life, not yesterday, certainly not last year, but right now, as we're thinking this through. I am a prey to misery and depression. I can't make a living that satisfies me. I have a feeling of uselessness. I am full of fear. I am unhappy. I can't seem to be of real help to other people. And my insight was, nor do I really care to be of real help to other people. Powerless in my body, my addiction. Powerless in my mind as part of the obsession. The real key to understanding no choice. But here we are in a position of neutrality, having finished the steps, practicing 10, 11, and 12. And Bill is saying we're not cured, we have a daily reprieve. Now we're going to take a look at what's on the screen now as selfishness, self-centeredness, as the bullseye heart of the matter. The part that I want to review with you today begins on page 60. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Okay, this isn't Bill's intention to bring us into unmanageability in step 1 when we looked at pages 44, 45, and 52. No, that was about step 2. His intention in this material that I'm looking at now, chapter 5, how it works, is his intention, his structure in the big book is to be looking at step 3. But at 10 years of sobriety, this man who introduced me to the set aside prayer and attitude pieced unmanageability together the way I'm piecing it to you, and it makes eminent sense once, in fact, we've been through it and you understand at least how I've puzzle pieced this together based on that man's instructions and based on my experience. The first requirement is that I be convinced that my life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Restless, irritable, and discontent. I'm abstinent, but I'm not happy. Going back to page 60. On that basis, we are almost always in collision with something or somebody, circumstances and people. That's a phrase you'll hear from me throughout our time together this year. Even though our motives are good. Well, that's part of our delusion, and we don't know that our motives are corrupt. Most people try to live by self-propulsion. Especially here in the United States, we were built on self-reliance. Each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. Bill likes the theater drama. He likes the theater analogy, the example of the theater. And I'll point that out when I see that he is weaving it into his suggestions. An actor who wants to run the whole show is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. Well, whose job is it to arrange the lights, to run the show, to arrange the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players? It's the director's job, all right? And we place ourselves as the director. It is true that we are the center of our life. That is, when you own that, it's wonderful. It's a spiritual experience, actually, when you own it. I am the center of my life, but it's equally a startling and embarrassing experience to have, as I did in 1988, when I went through these steps the first time when I was 4 years sober. I discovered that I thought, not in conscious way, but in the way I behaved, that I was the center of the world, not the center of my world, the center of the world. And I acted that way. If his arrangements would only stay put. Now the Al-Anons and the codependents are going to just love this material. If his arrangements, her arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as I wished, the show would be great. Staying with the drama, the theater. Everybody, including myself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, our actor may sometimes be quite virtuous, may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest and self-sacrificing. Mother Teresa. On the other hand, I may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest. All right? The devil incarnate. You hear the manipulation of that? I'm going to be nice to you as long as you do what I'm expecting. And then if you don't, I'm going to be mean to get you to do what I want. That manipulation. This is about willpower. I am making a decision. I am consciously or unconsciously attempting to be the director of my life and your life and all the lives around me. My boss at work, my coworkers at work, maybe the meetings I go to, maybe the sponsors that I have had. I don't take direction. I make up my own mind as to my program, not the program. But as with most humans, we are more likely to have varied traits. So on a scale of 1 to 10, some of us are at 2 in these areas and some of us are at 8 in these areas. And it might depend on the day or the week or the year or the age and stage. What usually happens? Well, the show doesn't come off very well. I begin to think life doesn't treat me very right. Now, notice I'm using the personal pronoun again, and I'm using the present tense again. You should try that and then read it out loud like you did with the bedevilments, if in fact you followed those suggestions, because those were the suggestions I received, and it was a very powerful process to write it as personal pronoun and present tense, and then to read it out loud so that I could actually hear it and experience it. I decide to exert myself more. Well, I'll get up earlier. I'll run harder. I'll go to more courses, more retreats, more workshops, I'll read more books, and I'll stay up later. He becomes on the next occasion still more demanding or gracious. Hear the manipulation again, as the case may be. Still, the play doesn't suit him. Life isn't going according to my script. This is the biggest lesson, I'll use that term, that I experienced in step 4, that I had a script. I didn't know that I had a script. I had a story. I didn't know that I had a story. I had a story about who I was, and I had a script about who you were and how the world should work. And I just used the word should. It's the key. And I'll use it again when we get to step 4, because it unlocks the door of our belief system. When I think or feel or say should, it's a yellow light, caution. It's not necessarily a distortion, but it's possibly a distortion. And I need to pause when I think or feel or say should and look at it. Is it objective? Is it the truth? Is it my experience? Is it real? What's my motive? Or is it just another piece of the delusional story that I've developed about myself and the script that I've developed about the world and the people in it? One of my good friends has made this wonderful insight. Step 4 is actually step 1 in writing. Step 1 is an experience. But step 4, when you put it in writing, is an experience of that powerlessness and that no choice. When we look at resentment that eats us alive, fear that drives us, and that dishonesty, that camouflage, that hiding, because we're so consciously or unconsciously afraid we'll be discovered for who we think we are, who we know we are, in part of our delusion about the story about our deficiencies, or an exaggeration about our grandiosity. It's an amazing journey. Well, a therapeutic journey, more therapeutic than any therapy I'd ever received, step 4 and 5. In this sense, the therapy I've received was wonderful and totally supportive and complementary, but I never penetrated the unconscious in therapy in the way I believe I penetrated the unconscious in doing step 4. That's my experience with it, and I'm introducing you to the possibilities of that at this point. Freud said it when he was looking at human development. All human beings need to make their unconscious conscious. Otherwise, they will conclude that they're a product, a victim of other people's malevolence or ill will or fate. Perennial victims. Not taking responsibility for their lives today. Many people have been victims. Terrible, unfortunate, tragic, even criminal experiences. Many people have been victimized, especially in their family of origin. Unfortunate. very real. But once you're 18 or 21, deal with it. And I say that with compassion. Deal with it. It's not their problem any longer, it's yours. At age 21. The level of adulthood of some kind of maturity, where we take 100% responsibility for the life that we have today. More about that when we get to step 4. Still, the play doesn't suit him. Admitting he may be somewhat at fault, he is sure that other people are more to blame. The victim. He becomes angry, indignant, self-pitying. What is the basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker, even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages well? That should be put in gold letters in everybody's slogans. Rest, W-R-E-S-T. What does that mean? It looks to me like it's part of wrestle. I can wrestle life to the ground if I know more, if I get stronger, if I'm meaner, if I'm kinder, if I get up earlier, if I try harder. If only I manage well. Is it not evident to everybody, the rest of the players, that these are the things that I want, and do not my actions make each of them wish to retaliate, snatching all they can get out of the show? Competitive, this is the world we live in. Is he not, even in his best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? And this man with a tongue-in-cheek said, not only are we not the director of the play, we are the producer of confusion. Twisting the words a little bit out of context. And so this next paragraph seems like almost a throwaway paragraph on Bill's part, but let's just take a look at it, treat it a little bit lightly. Our actor is self-centered, egocentric. Now, Bill's 1939, they were just discovering psychiatry and psychology as put out there by Freud and Carl Jung and some others, of course, of international repute. But the ego was a big deal at that time, as it is today, of course. He is like the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in the winter, complaining of the sad state of the nation. Well, pause for a minute. Bill is kind of being critical here in the way context and the way he's phrasing it. What's wrong with retiring and going to Florida and relaxing? Oh, he's complaining about the sad state of the nation. So he's just sitting in his armchair, not getting up and doing something about it. The minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century. And we've seen the hypocrites, the televangelists who are leading very dark lives in the shadows, and then it gets revealed. Politicians and reformers who are sure all would be utopia if the rest of the world would only behave. Well, it's so relevant today. No, I don't care what your politics are, but what would you say would really please a politician? Politicians and reformers who are sure all would be utopia, meaning perfect, if the rest of the world would only behave. Behave. Do what I tell you to do. That self-centeredness again. The outlaw safecracker who thinks society has wronged him. It's a common remark about people in prison that most of them think they're innocent. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it is one of those common things you hear. And the alcoholic who has lost all and is locked up. See, I don't understand why he put that in there. It doesn't seem to have the same kind of juice that the others' comments have. I just have to admit that. I don't know what that actually means there. But then he goes on, whatever our protestations, are not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, or self-pity? This is kind of an introduction to the whole concept of step 4, the whole concept of human behavior. I'm not going to get too deep into any of the aspects of step 4. I think I've said quite a bit, maybe more than enough about that. The whole point, and once you have done the 4th step, if your experience parallels mine, and you come back and read these 2 pages, 60 to 62, it will have so much more. This is like reading black and white. After you've done the 4th step and come back and reading it, it's like reading it in Technicolor, because you'll be able to, this is a skeleton, and after you do the 4th step, you'll be able to put flesh on the bones of that skeleton from your own personal experience. You'll see the application of that selfishness. And Bill now spends the next 2 paragraphs. This is the key that unlocks unmanageability. On page 52, we saw a behavioral description, those bedevilments. This is how we behave, those bedevilments on page 52. Here, he's going to give us a very analytical evaluation and proclamation as to what is the nature of and the source of those bedevilments, that behavior. Listen to this first sentence. Selfishness dash self-centeredness exclamation point. Man, that's a silver bullet. There's no verb. Selfishness, self-centeredness. Those are synonyms. They mean the same thing. Well, what do they mean? Let's go down and look more. That we think is the root of our trouble. Oh my. If selfishness is the root, if I had a tree here and you were all seeing the tree, and it was a live tree, you could see that it was a live tree in a large oak bucket. And you could see the trunk of the tree and the branches of the tree and the leaves. You would see it's a live tree. And if that tree had round orange balls on it, and I had not told you what kind of a tree it is, but you observe that it's a live tree and it has these large fruit on it, and I asked you, what kind of a tree is it? You would say it's an orange tree. You would say it in unison, because we evaluate the tree by the fruit of the tree. This is a very important image and model for understanding of this step work, especially 1 and 4. He is saying selfishness is the root. Well, in step 4, I've introduced you to what I think are the fruits of the root: resentment and fear and dishonesty. You can take a look at the Way of Life document, which has a picture of it that way, so that you can actually see that selfishness as the root, and springing out of the roots are these 3 or 4 or 5. I have more there because I include sex and secrets and shame and guilt. Driven by 100, going back to the book on page 62, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation. Pay attention to the words. This is how we operate. Oh my gosh, they got angry at us. Well, what did you do? Well, I just made an epithet or a joke. I was sarcastic. Oh, okay, then they're retaliating. Seemingly without provocation. What, can't they take a joke? I was only kidding. Yeah, maybe. But we invariably find that at some time in the past, we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. This is the key to the 4th step. We look at resentments and we see their origin in me. We look at fears and we see their origin in me. We look at our sex and dishonesty behaviors and our secrets and we see their origin in me. That's the bad news and the good news. Bill says it right here. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. Well, it sounds like bad news. Our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making, and yet it's really good news. Oh, if I'm causing my troubles and I have free will, then in fact, I can just make different decisions and take different actions, and I won't have these troubles. Yes, that's the truth. That's the turnaround that is committed to in step 3, made a decision to turn, and followed up by the actions of step 4 through 9, which are the turning. Steps 4 through 7, the turning in ourself, in terms of our relationship with ourself. Steps 8 and 9, the turning in relationship to others. Powerful. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. Please pay attention to the words. This is not an accident. Unmanageability is the human condition. Unmanageability is the human problem. The spiritual malady is all human beings have this selfishness. And then he says, and the alcoholic, the addict, is an extreme example of it. Probably because of the addiction. We're hardwired to, in fact, be more self-centered because of our addiction. I'm assuming that that's the logic there. Though he usually doesn't think so. I'm 43 years old and it never occurred to me that I was alcoholic. I'm 4 years sober and it never occurred to me that I was self-centered. And yet I was diagnosable. And the therapist, you've heard me say it maybe, and you will certainly hear me say it as we get closer to the 4th step, in terms of a personality disorder, narcissism. All right? I'm not sure that I read this to you before, but somebody in a meeting once said, and I've captured it on a piece of paper, an alcoholic is quite capable of such feelings as affection, caring, and love. These feelings just do not involve anyone else. Oh my God, so embarrassing. Anyway, a sense of humor, especially about yourself, is a sign of authentic spirituality. I've been assured by my own spiritual director. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. He's building a crescendo here. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. Oh, I'm as powerless over my willpower, my self-centeredness, as I am over my addiction. That's what he's saying here. Because I need God to get rid of it, this selfishness. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without God's aid. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore. Moral meaning a set of ethics, training in some type of spiritual tradition, religious tradition, and or knowledge of some kind from human development. But we could not live up to them, even though we would have liked to. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. Now he puts the wooden stake in the heart. This is the final blow to step 1, as it was presented to me. You may recall, well, let me read it. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. Notice, not only can we not get rid of it, but we can't even reduce it much by wishing or trying on our own power, our own willpower. There's the deficiency of the will. My will, this is a translation now, my interpretation. My will always choose me on its own power. I do not have freedom here. I have no choice. It's a survival mechanism. It's the way I'm built. It's a deficiency, if you want to look at it that way, that my will always choose me over you or anybody else. In the same way that my body is deficient, it does not successfully process alcohol, and my mind is inherently flawed, it does not successfully process reality. My will is inherently flawed. It will always choose me in preference to everybody and everything else on its own power. That's what Bill says we're not cured of, I believe, in step 10, page 85. We're not cured of this. We have a daily reprieve because as we finish step 9, we are turned. This is the image that I'll give you in step 3, but it's really relevant and helpful to know where we're going to have this image in our mind. If there is this life force and we are created, then in fact, we have free will. We have free will. We are not God. This is a major revelation to most of us. We are not the center of the universe. We are the center of our universe, and we make decisions based on self, which go across the life force, go across general principles, universal principles, spiritual principles. We are taking care of ourselves by our efforts at self-will, and the whole point of step 3, watch my hands, the whole point of step 3 is to turn my will and my life to be in alignment with the flow of the life force. Step 1 is I am an extreme example of self-will run riot, and I cannot turn to be in alignment on my own power. This is the launching pad for us then looking for a power that will in fact put us in proper alignment. We commit to that alignment in step 3 by completing steps 4 through 9, and then the will has its tendency to go back to self-will on a daily basis. Bill says in step 10, when they crop up, and we spot check during the day to be in alignment, and in the morning we set our sights on the guidance and the principles to be in alignment, and we're constantly working at being in alignment, and when we're in alignment, our life works. We're in the flow. So pay attention now. On page 43, Bill concluded in his own intention and structure of the Big Book and step 1, he concluded the first half of step 1. I believe in his own way, he was concluding step 1, period. It was brilliant that he was able to elaborate unmanageability in the next 2 chapters, but we had to pick it out. It had to be shown to me, and now I'm showing it to you. Listen to how he ends step 1. This is his intention from the Big Book structure on page 43. The alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. He's not talking about willpower. He's not talking about unmanageability. He's talking about addiction. The insight this man had was on page 62. He's talking about unmanageability. He's talking about our willpower. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. On page 43, except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense against the obsession. His defense must come from a higher power. And here on page 62, we had to have God's help. Now we're launched, poised to launch into step 2. We're not going into step 2 because I still want to spend some time chewing on this material to get the juice out of it so that we can have an experience with it and share that experience with one another to broaden and deepen even our own personal experience. Next week, I would like to discuss this on Tuesday. We're going to discuss it a little bit now, and we're going to discuss it next Monday in depth. On next Tuesday, I want you to have completed the will worksheet, which you will see is the bedevilments that are laid out just in the order that I've articulated them, with a couple other reflections and challenges and questions for you to attempt to spring yourself into having an experience with this today. Item number 7 in assignment 5. And then going back to page 60, item number 8. Going back to page 60, taking a look at this last paragraph, the statement. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success, and turn it into a question. At this point now, between now and next week, are you convinced? Turn it into a question, this statement. Am I convinced that my life run on self-will cannot be a success? Run on my own willpower cannot be a success. And write out a sentence or a paragraph or a page of reflection on that based on what you've experienced in doing the prior assignments. It's about your experience. Sure, your thoughts are important, but take a look at how you're living your life in terms of the quality of your life, assuming that you're abstinent. If you're not abstinent, kind of speculate as to what it would look like if you were abstinent, and what you would want it to look like in light of what we've been sharing. Be a little harder to do. All right. Well, that was robust. I hope it was helpful. And we're going to dedicate one more. Next Tuesday, we'll be completely looking at your experience with unpacking the worksheet on the will. So if you can, please completely dissociate unmanageability from any aspect of addiction. It is not relevant to the obsession in the sense that I want to talk about it. It is not relevant to the addiction. It's relevant to you're in a position of neutrality with regard to your addiction, and the quality of your life isn't at the level that you wanted, and you don't seem to be able to get it to where you want it on your own power. What a rich community and conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your lives with each other. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.